Hi all. Welcome to the panel discussion on the topic COVID second wave, lessons learned and way ahead, organized by Amrita Hospitals, Kochi. For the same, we have an expert panel here. Let me first introduce the panelists to you. On my right, I have Dr. Anil sir. He is the head of the Department of Microbiology at Amrita Hospitals. Dr. Manraj sir is a professor in Department of Pediatrics and also consultant at Public Health Research, Amrita. On my left, I have Dr. Marilyn Moni. She is an associate professor in Division of Infectious Diseases at the hospital. Dr. Shyam sir, consultant professor in Department of Anesthesiology and Critical Care at Amrita. And last but not least, Dr. Deepu. He is the associate professor in the Department of Infectious Diseases at the hospital. Without much delay, let us proceed with the discussion. I will start off with Manraj sir. So the first question is, I think I'll put it very simple. Why did the second wave happen? Were we able to predict it, or could somebody predict it to the same extent as it has happened? And also, was it somehow preventable?
Okay, you have three questions in one go. So the question as to why the second wave happened is quite simple. The first wave, when things were controlled by multiple restrictions and a lot of other factors, and a significant portion of the population was infected and then they recovered from that, it naturally comes to a downhill. And when we see a downhill, the natural reflection of governments and population is to relax. So in the meantime, the entire globe, what we saw was there was a decent gap between first and second wave. So that tells you that's a predictable pattern globally, not just for India. So in that lull, governments relax, people relax, and in that time, what we forgot is that the virus was preparing for a second innings out there. So the variants came with increased infectivity, different mutations, so that it could infect more people, infect again and again. So that was one reason. Lead epidemiologists all over the globe predicted that there could be multiple waves like the 1917 Spanish flu. So there would be a second wave which probably could be larger, and then there could be multiple waves, and they all had a feeling that the second wave could be more brutal, and by the time we have a second wave, probably we could be having enough controls to contain that. And somewhere there in Maharashtra, we started seeing our own variant, the double mutant. We are not supposed to call that, but that one had one mutation which could increase the infectivity by another 20%. And in one of those mutations, it could even lead to immune escape by the tune of 50%. So you are having a virus with 20% extra infectivity and 50% immune escape. In that sense, it could reinfect people. It could also infect people with vaccinations. Okay. Nobody could prevent the second wave, but you could have prevented the rapid spread of that second wave. Okay. Preventing a second wave is beyond us, but you can see that the inclination at which India reached 4 lakh cases a day, something like that, that was never seen, not in US, not in Europe, anywhere other places. And today as we speak, India broke the record of the maximum deaths reported by a single country, 4,300. US in last January was something like 4,003, and so we had the worst day of our COVID as of today. So nobody could have prevented the second wave, but India could have prevented such a bad second wave. Okay.
I think that kind of sets the ball rolling for today's discussion. And as we have already moved into the second wave, I think my next question is to Dr. Marilyn. Dr. Marilyn, is there any difference between the way the patients are presenting to us in the symptomatology between the first wave and the so-called second wave?
Yeah, definitely there is, even though the basic symptomatology remains the same, with the basic presentation being respiratory, with the dry cough, throat pain, upper respiratory symptoms, and in some cases with diarrhea, vomiting, fever, myalgia, and other constitutional symptoms. There is a difference in which in the people whom we are observing these symptoms. So there is a basic difference. The basic difference between the first wave and the second wave is that by the time we had the second wave, a portion of our elderly people above 60 years were vaccinated. So now we have less of hospital admissions for them. Less of them are getting severe, while the healthy young adults who were relatively asymptomatic in the first wave, they are relatively getting more symptomatic this time, and there is a higher proportion of them getting in hospital admission, and a higher proportion of the in hospital admissions among them leading to ICU admission, oxygen requirement, and even other adverse outcomes. Per se, basically the symptomatology remains the same, but the severity of the symptoms, both among general public and healthcare workers, presently being to the milder side due to vaccination, maybe could have been due to vaccination. That's my take on it.
Okay. Thank you. I'll come back to you with another clinical question, but let me move on to Anil sir. Sir, I mean, we know there are a lot of tests available to, like not a lot of, at least your common known RT-PCR, then you have the antibody test, then the antigen test. Especially with the second wave, I believe there is a lot of interest on the antibody test also. So if you can just help us understand what test is indicated when.
Yeah, that's a very good question, because by the time we came to the second wave, we have a lot of tests available. The first wave, we were just struggling to establish the RT-PCR, which was something new and a high-end test which came into a local application. So when we look at the pyramid of the testing, the top lies the nucleic acid testing, that is an RT-PCR. Everybody says it's an RT-PCR. It's an open system, open RT-PCR. But you have a closed system also, GeneXpert, TrueNat, all these are RT-PCR.
Okay.
So all nucleic acid tests at the top, and you can use it in any patient.
Okay.
But the highest sensitivity lies when you use it in a patient with high index of suspicion and some amount of symptoms. Just because you have seen a patient of COVID, you can't go and get a RT-PCR that. It will never come positive.
Okay.
So you have to develop some symptoms. So the threat of infection doesn't mean that you go and test for RT-PCR. You just go only if you are symptomatic. Only then the test comes positive. Only it's worth doing it rather than wasting the resources by testing uselessly. So the top is RT-PCR. The second comes the antigen. Now antigen can be used in widespread, in large scale manner, and it can be done in caps. So when you have a large community outbreak, it makes sense to use a cheaper test which is easily available. And when you have a lot of symptomatic people, best is to go for an antigen test. Antigen only in symptomatic cases. Don't go for anybody who doesn't have any symptom or very mild symptoms. Antigen comes positive, it is COVID, unless and until.
So you need not repeat it.
Yeah, don't do anything else. Just it's a proven case of COVID.
Okay.
If antigen comes negative, then you have to go for a PCR because the guy is symptomatic.
Okay.
So you have to go for an RT-PCR. So that is the hierarchy, and then the antibody test. Now antibody has come recently, and now it adds to the confusion that we have qualitative antibodies, we have quantitative antibodies, and then the different values given by different manufacturers. So it creates a lot of confusion. So if you want to use antibody for a diagnostic assay, as a diagnostic assay for COVID, then you use it only in cases which are antigen and RT-PCR negative. You have a high index of suspicion that this guy is having COVID, or you have a patient with post-COVID syndrome. 80% of people don't realize they had COVID. So they come with fibrosis, lung fibrosis, or multi-system inflammatory syndrome, and you don't have any antecedent test saying that they had a COVID before. So there you can go for an antibody test with the catch that you do it after 14 days.
Okay.
Only after 14 days you can get a reliable amount of IgG and IgM. And if we do IgG testing after 14 days preferably, if we have such cases of MISC, that is multi-system inflammatory syndrome, or post-COVID syndrome, or you do a CT for a patient with respiratory failure and the radiologist says it's a CORAD 4 or CORAD 5, then you better go for an antibody test. Now, with the advent of vaccination, people are asking for antibodies for vaccine, whether we are immune or not. Nobody has got a guideline saying that what antibody is protective, what is neutralizing antibody, but still there are levels, cutoff levels of plasma donors that will come later on, but it can be used, but it's too premature to use it and too premature to feel good about it.
Okay. I think that makes it very clear. I think I'll move on to Dr. Deepu. Deepu, especially with the second wave, we are keeping a lot of patients at home care, and even the government advises to manage a certain subgroup of patients at home care. So what are the key things to remember when somebody is in home care, and what is basically the admission criteria, or what point will you decide somebody needs to come to a hospital? If you can elaborate on that.
Okay, thank you. So that is a very practical question everyone needs to know about. So, thing is that we all know that COVID-19 disease causes disease of various severity. Many patients are asymptomatic, and we come across asymptomatic people. As I told you, usually we will not test for asymptomatic people, but then for other reasons, maybe as part of contact tracing or as part of travel purposes, they will do the testing. And at that time, we come to know that the patient is COVID positive. So we have an asymptomatic group, and among the symptomatic group, we have patients with varying severity.
Okay.
Majority are mild. Some will go into moderate to severe disease. So since majority of the disease majority of the patients who are getting COVID-19 are falling into the milder category, definitely home quarantine is a very good option. And in order to prevent our healthcare system from overwhelming, definitely home care has to be advised. So now when the people are in home quarantine, they need to be aware of certain facts, like what are they going to monitor. So the basic understanding is that the COVID-19 disease, Dr. Merlin already told the symptomatology, so I am not repeating the symptomatology, but the basic understanding is that the COVID-19 will cause infection of the lung to varying degrees. So if a patient is having a reasonable sparing of the lung, then the patient's oxygenation status should be normal. If the patient's lung involvement is kind of moderate to severe, then there has to be a reflection of that involvement, and that reflection needs to be captured. So subjectively, the patient will start feeling a lot of cough and high spiking fever, which is suggestive of the high inflammatory state the patient is having, especially the prolonged high state fever. Also breathlessness, especially the exertional breathlessness. So these are few warning signs which the patient themselves can pick up. Prolonged bouts of cough, worsening cough, fever, prolonged fever, so and also the breathlessness. So this is subjective feeling. Objectively, definitely right now everyone knows that we need to monitor for oxygenation level in the blood. So the pulse oximeter has to be there, and the saturation, reasonable saturation is 95 or more. If the saturation is less than 95, then that indicates almost 70 to 80% of the lung is involved. Only 20% of the lung is spared. So in such scenario, he definitely needs a hospital care. So saturation less than 94 is something which everyone needs to be aware of. But thing is that with more and more pulse oximeters, how much we can rely on the saturation. So that is also a big challenge. So even before buying a pulse oximeter, I think we should test it, ensure that the saturation, baseline saturation is somewhere close to 100, and then buy the saturation probe. And once the saturation is less, at that time also, sometimes, even some dyes in some Q-tex, all those things can interfere with the reading. So in such scenario, one thing everyone can do in their home is 6-minute walk test. They can just walk up and down and then recheck the saturation. If the saturation is true, if the saturation is false, if the saturation is really false, really low, then with exertion, the saturation has to come down further. In such scenario also, they have to expedite the hospital admission. So these are a few things we need to be aware of. The patients needs to be aware of while opting for home quarantine.
Perfect. I'll move on to Shyam sir. Sir, what are the key laboratory tests which are of concern in a critically ill COVID patient? And also, as a continuation to that question, what are the key factors which we keep in mind when we say this patient needs oxygen, or this patient needs NIV, or this patient needs ventilator? So I'm clubbing two questions together, please.
Yeah, the first question is lab parameters. So
Yes.
there are many lab parameters that have been recommended, but not that every lab parameter is going to tell you something perfectly, or it will prognosticate. But the routine lab parameters, of course, would be a complete blood count. We just need to know, because if there is a supradded bacterial infection coming up, only then your white count might go up. Apart from that, another useful thing would be C-reactive protein, CRP. Not just doing it once, but if you've done a C-reactive protein, monitoring it serially might give us more clue, like whether it's going up or coming down. That will be more important. Some of the other tests that are recommended to pick up worsening or the so-called cytokine storm would include your interleukin-6, but how useful it is another question, because various other conditions also, even ARDS, sepsis, it can go up. But interleukin-6, if available, can be monitored. Ferritin, LDH, and all D-dimer are the three other tests that are very useful in determining the severity, and also which will help you with the management of your cases. These are some of the lab parameters that we do. Of course, chest X-ray is very important, and not to forget, we mentioned about oxygenation and all that. So an arterial blood gas is probably one of the most important tests that you do. It is available quickly, the results are available. So if required, to have an invasive arterial monitoring and blood sampling would be the most important thing for someone in an ICU.
Okay.
Moving on to your question of who requires oxygen, who requires NIV. Oxygen is simple, like Dr. Deepu mentioned. Any saturation up to above 95 is definitely acceptable. Only then they come to the hospital, and in the hospital they might be in a ward scenario. They could be given oxygen even in the ward. But if the oxygen requirement is going up because your saturation is not maintaining above 95, is the time that you might think of moving them to a high dependency unit or an ICU. In the ICU, if the oxygen requirement keeps going up, you might have to consider giving them a non-invasive ventilation, because what we've all seen all over the world is that non-invasive ventilation is very useful modality in the COVID patients, in especially severe COVID. So you would initiate non-invasive ventilation, the BiPAP or CPAP. I would specifically prefer BiPAP. One other modality is the high flow nasal cannula, which has been from the very beginning. We have been a little on the lesser side using of HFNC, but with this current oxygen shortage that is there all over, HFNC is probably not a good modality because it uses a lot of oxygen. So NIV is something when you would use if there is increasing oxygen requirement, if the work of breathing is going up, the patient is becoming more and more tachypneic, you would probably put them on NIV and monitor them. If they are doing well, if the oxygenation is maintained, the work of breathing comes down, they are not becoming too tachypneic, the respiratory rate is, I say, below 35 or definitely below 30, you could continue on NIV. But if the respiratory rate keeps going up, your oxygenation drops further on NIV, is the time you might consider invasive. Keeping in mind that people going on to that level of severity, the outcomes have generally not been good. People needing invasive ventilation, especially during the first wave, when more elderly were getting the severe disease. What we have all seen is that the patients going on to invasive ventilation generally don't tend to do well. But if your oxygenation is not maintained with NIV, if the work of breathing is too much, the respiratory rate is more than 45 in spite of all medication and NIV that you have given, you may have to ventilate a patient.
Okay, sir. I think that's very clear. I'll move on to Anil, sir. Sir, especially there is a lot of interest with mucormycosis, and a lot of media attention is also happening onto that. So, what is your take on this occurrence of any kind of secondary infections in COVID patients?
Secondary infection is bound to occur if the patient is in the hospital. That's a normal thing. It's not something out of the blue that's coming in.
Okay.
And 10 days of hospitalization, invariably Dr. Sham would agree that he may end up with a pneumonia, hospital-acquired pneumonia. It depends on the condition of the patient also.
Okay.
Mild, moderate, severe, and we don't get patients who are having only COVID. He may be on dialysis. He may be a malignancy patient with a central line already inserted in him, taking chemotherapy, or liver failure patient, or liver transplant patient, or a bone marrow transplant patient. These guys, when they come in, so they have a high risk of getting infection.
Okay.
So invariably, they may end up with infection, not even 10 days, even 5 days of hospitalization may end up with infection. And moreover, if you ask our clinicians, they have a lot of restrictions in handling the patients, COVID patients. They are in PPE. So it's not like handling a normal patient in ICU, it's handling a COVID patient with a lot of gear on it, and so contamination, infection, everything goes on. So treating a COVID patient itself has a very big risk of getting infected. So, and moreover, if the clinician decides to give him mechanical ventilation, then hospital-acquired pneumonia or ventilator-associated pneumonia is very common. And studies have shown that secondary bacterial infection in mild cases, community-acquired infection with pneumococci and Haemophilus is very rare. So you don't require an antibiotic in a mild, moderate case. But if you have a patient who is hospitalized on ventilation or supplemental oxygen or anything, he may get 5 to 10% of the cases may get developed infection. But people who die on ventilator, post-mortem studies have shown that 30% people had bacterial infection in the lung. That is Acinetobacter, Pseudomonas, E. coli, Klebsiella. So they do have secondary infection. And when it comes to fungal infection, it's the hot topic now. Aspergillus is something that we have seen in few cases, but not something that is out of proportion. We have seen it. But proving aspergillus is a big deal, because you have to get a very valuable specimen, that is a bronchoscopic specimen. Now, who will do a bronchoscopy in a COVID patient? So only bronchoscopic specimen, if it grows aspergillus or shows fungus, it's significant. Sputum is not a very good specimen. So diagnosis is a very bit difficult part, and galactomannan serum doesn't come positive that often. And mucormycosis, we've seen only 2 cases as of now, one in 2020 and one recently, but it was not a proven case, we couldn't get the tissue. Both expired. Mucormycosis is really bad, but it depends on the region where they come from. In Kerala, there's no much abuse of steroids as such. In other states, steroids is freely available, and they prescribe steroids right, left and center, and they take domiciliary in very high doses. So they don't realize that steroids is a double-edged sword. So there we see a lot of the institute where I came from. I studied in Gujarat. So there they have seen at least 400 cases of mucormycosis. So that's really astounding. So there is something going really good. It's a man-made calamity, I would say, with diabetes, with steroids, with COVID. So that sort of a thing has not happened yet in Kerala, because we are quite measured in treating the patient in domiciliary care. We don't give anything beyond what is recommended.
Okay, I'll move on to Dr. Deepu. I think I'll take lead from where Merlin left. Basically, she already told that in the second wave, we are seeing a lot of younger people getting involved. But a larger question remains that is there any difference in like the rate of transmittability or the way things are spreading? Do you feel is it any different from the first wave?
Yeah, regarding the pattern of infection, especially as Dr. Merlin told, that is one thing which is very striking. You know, you just cannot ignore the fact that during our first COVID wave, we were seeing a lot of people who are above 60 years, old age group. But this time, you know, definitely there are people who are above 60 years, but we are seeing more of younger population, less than 45 years, 45 to 50 years. So these group of patients are coming to the hospital, and a bigger proportion of them, larger proportion of them are moving on to the ICU. So that is one thing which is very striking. Another thing is that regarding the pregnant ladies, in the first wave also, we used to get a lot of COVID positive pregnant patients, but then they were never going into that oxygen requirement situation. But in this wave, we are seeing more and more of pregnant ladies requiring oxygen. So that is 2 observations which we are really seeing. What is the reason for that observation? Of course, one may be due to the mutant strain which are told, maybe double mutant B1.617, or maybe because, you know, like especially the old age and more than 45 years, our vaccination rollout happened in such a way that we categorize them into high risk, more than 45 years, age-based risk stratification we did, and then we had vaccinated that group. So probably that also would be one factor leading on to this kind of pattern currently which we are seeing. But then that cannot explain the pattern which we are seeing in pregnant ladies. So definitely virus also might have a contributory role in the pattern which we are seeing is what my personal take.
Right. I'll move on to Dr. Merlin. Merlin, basically compared to the first wave, by the time the second wave happened, there is a lot of evidence which has come in for and against a lot of the pharmacological measures we had. So if you can just very concisely tell how different is the pharmacological treatment for COVID compared to the first wave and the second wave?
Okay, so as compared to the first wave and second wave, one major breakthrough was the total elimination of azithromycin and HCQs from the treatment protocols, maybe across the globe. So there has been robust evidence against both of these in COVID. So initially we also, during the first wave, we also used to prescribe azithromycin and maybe HCQs to a lower extent. But as per the current protocols, they have completely taken these off. Previously, these were in use for mild and moderate categories of the disease, and we don't have any protocols as of now. All protocols are amended and taken off azithromycin and HCQ.
Okay.
And of the drugs which are currently available, the major evidence is in the direction of usage of steroids, and that is one thing which has robust evidence in that direction. And steroids with the onset of hypoxia, so we do have evidence with steroids with a moderate and severe disease, with dexamethasone 6 mg dosed at 6 mg for 5 to 10 days, having mortality benefit in this category of disease. So that has remained unchanged with the first and the second waves, but definitely the dosage is, during the first wave we had given a higher dosage of 4 mg TID equivalent to 12 mg, and now it's proven that 6 mg daily is equally efficacious as the higher dose. So considering the the impaired glycemic status and the high risk of secondary infections with a higher dosage and the lack of additional clinical benefit, we are lingering to the 6 mg OD dose, which is faring quite well also. Now, another major breakthrough was the recent introduction of the ivermectin into the guidelines. So the national and the state guidelines have adopted ivermectin for the usage in mild COVID cases. So ivermectin is a long time FDA approved antiparasitic drug, which has had some antiviral properties, proven antiviral properties in West Nile virus and even in HIV also. And now currently it is of interest in COVID, and nearly 50 trials are working on ivermectin. We don't have currently high quality evidence in this regard, but still 96% of the completed trials are reporting mortality benefit and also benefit in terms of progression, decreasing the severity of the progression of severity of the disease, or decreasing the progressiveness from mild to moderate and moderate to severe. So we are still waiting on board to see the real world scenario with the use of ivermectin. Another thing which we have introduced into mild cases is inhaled budesonide. So after an interesting observation of the lack of progression of disease in people using inhaled steroids in UK, they have undertaken this trial of inhaled budesonide in mild cases within 7 days of onset of disease, and they have proven that these people do have the progression is significantly less. So we also currently recommend inhaled budesonide twice daily for people in home quarantine in early phases of disease, and also mild disease with who are admitted in due to other causes into the hospital. As for the severe category, so IV remdesivir do have some role, especially in decreasing the length of stay of these patients, even though the all-cause mortality remains unchanged. But for moderate to severe cases, we are using remdesivir for a duration of 5 days as per the current protocols of the state and the country. So in addition to that, a newer drug which is a JAK inhibitor, which is baricitinib, has recently been approved for use in India. So this has been recently proved in the trials that baricitinib with remdesivir can have additional clinical benefits. So we have actually recently introduced baricitinib in those patients who progress even with remdesivir. So along with that, there were exploratory therapies earlier which have fallen out of wagon, mainly the plasma therapy and all, but newer evidences have come up showing the absence of benefit. So I think we may have to amend the protocols accordingly so as to make it into compassionate therapies or exploratory therapies only in the setting of clinical trials and so on.
I think that kind of covered all the commonly used drugs very, very clearly. Shyam sir, another key thing which we are hearing a lot is about proning. Proning was something which we used in critical care from some time, but especially with this awake proning and early proning. So if you can throw some light into what is the basic mechanism behind it, and is it really useful?
Yeah, prone position is something that we have used for the management of patients on mechanical ventilation with severe ARDS or moderate to severe ARDS. There have been good data earlier itself, especially from the time of the H1N1 pandemic and even before that, and especially subsequently. So we have been using prone position for mechanically ventilated, intubated and ventilated patients. We have been doing prone.
Yes,
But with this COVID, what is new is the advent of prescribing awake proning. So why not prescribe awake proning? So see, this proning is mainly helpful in ARDS. The mechanism in ARDS is that the posterior parts of the lung, when we lie supine, is more injured, or all CTs and all that have always shown.
Okay.
So the oxygenation is severely affected because of that, but the perfusion is more towards the the posterior areas. So you're going to have a definite mismatch, and that's how proning them. So now the diseased lung is on top.
Okay.
So you have better oxygenation to the dependent and perfusion, and also the pressure coming off the posterior areas will gradually enhance in opening up of the lung over there. And the other important benefit is the heart and the great vessels compress on your lung when you're supine, but when you're prone, it falls off from the lung. So these are some of the mechanism by which proning helps. So this was then adopted to awake patients who are not on a ventilator, or sometimes if they are on NIV. So what is being prescribed, and what we also do is that if someone is requiring oxygen, we start them to tell them to lie down on their tummy as much as they tolerate. So there's no prescribed time. As long as they can tolerate, they can lie on their tummy. So that is what we tell the patients. If someone is on a non-invasive, sometimes initial couple of days when the workup breathing is very high, they might be on a continuous non-invasive. That time they may not tolerate the proning. But sometimes what we do is, if we can give them small breaks from the non-invasive, keep them on oxygen, nasal prongs, mask, during that time we ask them to lie on their tummy. So that helps a lot, and we have seen quite good response to this proning. Coming to invasive ventilation, if they are having moderate to severe ARDS criteria based on the blood gas, and if their oxygen requirements are very high, PEEP requirements are going up, we definitely prone them. And the proning we follow is like what is the guidelines of 16 to 18 hours in a 24-hour session. But sometimes we have extended the proning sessions beyond 24 hours. We have gone up to 36 hours of proning, because in spite of proning, we have not seen great improvement in the first 12 to 16 hours. So that's when we have tried to extend the proning up to 36 hours. But the general recommendation is to prone them for 16 to 18 hours in a day, then supine them for another 4 to 6 hours. Do these sessions if required, repeat them on a daily basis. Many patients, I would say, if you're doing, they would require at least 3 or 4 such sessions. It gives a very good response. Oxygenation definitely improves in them. In this second wave, we have had very young patients who had severe COVID, who had to be intubated and all that. And we've had at least few instances where proning has helped and they have improved, and we have been able to extubate them. So proning is definitely useful. What is new is awake proning in patients who are not ventilated, and proning definitely for ventilated patients if they have moderate to severe ARDS.
Just in continuation to that question, I mean, how do you feed the patients when the patients are prone? Like, is it something which we?
Okay, on mechanical ventilation, most of them are getting tube feeds or enteral feeds through the Ryle's tube. So that goes as in continuous infusion. We don't give boluses. So we give them feeds for 18 hours in a day. When you're proning, it could be a risk. It's not that you cannot feed them through the Ryle's tube. You can, but they may not tolerate the 75 to 100 ml per hour usual infusion rates. You may have to cut down. Some patients do not tolerate. They start regurgitating. We might have to keep them nil per oral during the proning sessions. You can give smaller quantity if they tolerate.
Okay. I think that makes it very clear. Moving on to Anil sir. Sir, Merlin also hinted about the evidence regarding convalescent plasma therapy with the recent updated guidelines is not that great. So, can you just throw some light why this has happened, why this has fallen off the recommendation?
That's a very pertinent question, because everybody is talking about plasma therapy and it's become out of fashion all of a sudden. So you have to realize that plasma therapy began in 19th century, 1900s. And the first Nobel Prize for Physiology was given for plasma therapy or serum therapy in diphtheria. So it is there, and we still practice it because we use immunoglobulin as treatment. We use convalescent plasma is a crude therapy. It's just a crude plasma which we assume that contains antibody, and we infuse it. And we used it because we didn't have anything else to do. As Dr. Merlin has told us, we have many options now. Steroids are very good. We never realized that that was a very good option in the first wave. So rather than standing in front of the patient and waiting him to die, we have to give him something, and plasma therapy was something which was historically proven that can be given. And it was given in Spanish flu also. So that's the logic, and they did it, but logistics are real bad. getting a patient, because we didn't have diagnostic, we didn't have antibody assays. So there were two landmark trials, and we should be really appreciative. ICMR did a very splendid trial, though the numbers were not that great. The Placid trial,
Okay.
and they started 1 year ago, April and October. And October they published it, and they had some 500 odd patients, 200 to 230 in each arm. One arm containing the plasma therapy, and the other arm the standard of care.
Yeah.
And they came with the conclusion that there is no difference in mortality or anything. You give plasma, it doesn't make any difference. They did a subgroup analysis, and they checked whether the plasma with higher antibodies makes a difference or not.
Okay.
Even that didn't make a difference.
Okay.
But somehow ICMR didn't believe itself. So they published in October in BMJ, but still they did continue to recommend plasma therapy.
Okay.
They waited for the recovery trial that came from UK.
Okay.
It's published only 5 days ago
Okay.
in Lancet.
Okay.
They came with the same conclusion with 11,000 patients,
Okay.
5,500 odd in each arm. Extremely well done study. They even tested the antibody titers before giving the plasma, and they found that rarely you see a table which contains the intervention and the standard of care having the same numbers, exactly the same numbers, 24% here, 24% there, everything is same. And they gave a one-line conclusion: it's useless, doesn't save the patient, doesn't improve anything. And then all of a sudden ICMR realized, we did a very good job last year itself. And they said that plasma therapy is not that great. But having said that, anecdotal reports are there, observation studies are there, even Merlin will vouch for it that patients do seem to improve with plasma therapy. And there are indications, there are smaller studies where they say the patients don't have antibodies with them. That is patients with B cell deficiency, malignancy patients, bone marrow transplant patients, elderly patients. You give them plasma, they may do well because they need some amount of antibody to help them. But not an immunocompetent patient, but the jury is still out there to decide whether it's actually good or not. But monoclonal antibody works because they are pure monoclonal antibodies that targeted, but they are very, very expensive. And they have been approved EUA. But plasma therapy is a crude form of monoclonal therapy where you try to harvest it from patients. And Dr. Merlin will vouch that it's a very difficult thing to get a donor, screen them, and get the plasma. And by the time we are ready, the patient may already go into the ventilator or may become worse.
Okay.
Can we
That
get
yeah,
Merlin's-
please, sir. Yeah.
Can we get Merlin's thought on plasma therapy?
Merlin.
So I second with sir. With the recent evidence, it might get at least temporarily out of the wagon, I think, because the evidence is quite strong in that regard. But anecdotally, there had been patients who benefited from plasma therapy. Especially, we had done a series of plasma therapies where we looked into the titers and gave them only the plasmas which were actually the titers were good enough. So maybe in this trial settings, it was better regulated and matched, and so I think we will follow the guidelines, and that would make better sense rather than.
Okay. So I think we have covered the treatment part and all. So I think we'll move on to the another key topic of interest, that be regarding the vaccines. Dr. Deepu, there's a lot of vaccine options now, like at least a few with us. So I mean, can you just elaborate on? I mean, is there any preference for one vaccine over the other, and especially in this background of the second wave, how are the vaccines going to help us as we move ahead?
There is because of the second wave, Manraj sir already mentioned that we are seeing immune escape variants. So there is always a concern, but still one thing we need to be very clear is that even in the second wave, the vaccinated individuals becoming sick are kind of very less.
Okay.
In the sense that they are not getting severe disease. So they are getting disease, but then the proportion of the vaccinated individuals, when compared with the proportion of non-vaccinated individuals, definitely the numbers are low. And even if they are getting infected, definitely the severity of the disease is low. So definitely we have to go with vaccine. There is no other option. We cannot just wait and watch. If you are waiting and watch, third wave will come, fourth wave will come, fifth wave will come, then this wave will never end also. We don't know. So definitely vaccine is the way forward. And of course there will be some immune variant, but that is okay. At this point of time, the studies conducted by the National Institute has proven that the current vaccine which we are using in India, the Covishield and Covaxin, has the potential, has the immune ability to neutralize the current mutant variant as well. Maybe to a lesser extent, but definitely it has. So we definitely the other vaccines are also is coming. Sputnik is coming. Dr. Reddy's is going to come with it, and Novavax Inc., the US vaccine, is also on its way. So right now we have to move in the direction of vaccine.
Just in continuation to that, how often are you seeing vaccine breakthroughs in our setting? Like,
Yeah, in our settings, we have two major types of vaccine breakthroughs.
okay,
One being the patients who have had the 2 doses of vaccine and coming in with the disease, and maybe partially vaccinated, those who have completed a single dose of vaccine coming in with the disease. But they do, even though they come in with the disease, we did not have even a single ICU admission in patients who has had both the doses.
Okay.
We had a single ICU admission for a patient who had a single dose of vaccine,
Okay.
and that too within 2 weeks of the presentation of the disease.
Right.
So I must definitely vouch that the vaccine definitely prevents the severity of the disease, especially the change in the pattern of the age group which we are seeing with the ICU admissions currently. That would rather mirror the protection given by the vaccine in some sort of way. The second major thing is that we have our major chunk of healthcare workers are vaccinated, but still we have breakthrough infections in healthcare workers who are vaccinated. So that being said, the high transmissibility is still there, but the severity is I cannot say that the vaccine can bring down the transmissibility. Maybe because the symptoms are less severe, there can be carriers who are mildly symptomatic or asymptomatic also. But definitely the healthcare workers are also getting milder forms of disease. None of them had major ICU admissions or anything of that sort. So the transmissibility remains, but the mild definitely the severity of disease is curtailed.
Okay. Manu sir, coming back to you. So, do you think this COVID-19 vaccine would be more like become a yearly affair like the influenza vaccines and all?
It's a high probability out there.
Okay.
It all depends on how these mutations evolve from time to time.
Okay.
See, right now India is dominated by the Maharashtra strain, the double mutant strain, the UK strain, and the rest, the conventional one, and a very minute percentage probably the South African strain. As Divu was mentioning, as Merlin also added to it, if you look at the double mutant strain, the neutralizing antibody levels are reduced by something like 50% for both Covishield and Covaxin.
Okay.
So, you are looking at neutralizing antibody levels to half. That also tells you that you could get reinfections with a given strain. So, that remains a probability out there. With the South African strain, this was first noticed by the South African strain, both Moderna and Pfizer showed decreased efficacy to that. But the UK strain, surprisingly, the reduction was only 5%. So, if you are infected predominantly by the UK strain, you could have said, we could forget all this and move on normally. But if something moves from the double mutant or something similar comes like every 6 months, this would become most likely the American flu shot every year. In US and Canada or entire Europe, every winter, the first thing you do is you make up mass flu shot vaccine, and people are used to that. Get your flu shot, enjoy the winter kind of thing. India may move on to that, and that I can't be sure of that, but that's a high probability out there.
Okay. Okay.
It's most likely to happen.
Fine. Okay, sir. Right. Moving on to Shyam sir. Sir, especially with this critically ill patients, what are the kind of what can we label as the signs of recovery, and are we seeing any kind of long-term complications in such patients?
Okay, among critically ill patients requiring long-term care,
Okay.
like I mentioned, one thing is when they go on to an invasive ventilation stage, the mortality is pretty high.
Okay.
But the patients who have somehow recovered after invasive ventilation, or the ones who have required NIV and they have required, a significant proportion of patients, especially in the second wave, are continuing to require some sort of a respiratory support. So I would say our non-COVID ICU right now, around 20 to 25% of the patients are post-COVID
Okay,
patients,
okay,
requiring some sort of an intensive care. So one common scenario is they require some continued respiratory support. This could be because the fibrosis developing, we're all very familiar with it. Some degree of fibrosis developing, that is quite possible. The second group of patients in the ICU are with the neurological complications. So even right now we have at least 1 or 2 patients who are probably, we're not sure, but we could label them as post-viral encephalitis with seizures, with the resistant seizures. So the typical, autoimmune encephalitis that we have seen. So we currently have at least a couple of patients like that. So that's a very serious group that we would be encountering.
Okay.
Then comes the cardiac involvement. There are many patients who complained of palpitations and all that, but we're not seen any severe disease, cardiac disease following COVID, but there are case reports, there are people who have complained of palpitations and all that. So these are the critically ill patients who would come. I'm not talking about the long term. We are yet to see that milder problems that they could face. So the patients who require critical care support are the groups who require continued respiratory support because of fibrosis or any neurological involvement. Those are the 2 main groups that I could immediately think of who would require a long-term care.
And the first part, what are the signs of recovery, early signs of recovery? How can you
the signs of
any
recovery,
patterns?
we just see them, the main organ support they require is the respiratory.
Okay.
So when they are out of the respiratory support, that we would, even if they are on continued oxygen support, we would just gradually move them out, train them on, physiotherapy, breathing exercises, incentive spirometry and all that, and ask them to gradually, continue all this as required. I'm not going into the medication part of it, but then if they are hemodynamically stable, they are conscious, their respiratory support is coming to a minimal level, they can be out of the ICU.
Okay.
But sometimes they get into this multi-organ sort of scenario, needing dialysis and all that. So that's an entirely different group of people who might require continued care for some more time.
Okay. I think we started off with Mani sir. I think the last question also I'll come back to you. Sir, when do you feel is this the current third wave going to end in Kerala or in a larger picture India itself, and second wave, and are we in fact expecting a third wave after this, and is there any way we can predict or any measures which can kind of prevent a third wave?
Naturally there will be a third wave,
Okay.
but that's just mathematics. You have the second wave that's at the peak, and we have the lockdowns in several states, maybe 12, 14 states have lockdown now. Kerala has probably crossed the worst days now, and Kerala could be down to a standstill like in another 6 to 8 weeks.
Okay.
So the Kerala second wave could be maximum 6-week duration, most likely will be below that. So you have to understand that when you reach the bottom, you have a high probability of something higher than that.
Okay.
So there is a technical probability of the third wave is going to happen. But it's not like the Supreme Court recently said, like it would be massive, it will be brutal, it will take care of adolescents and children, nothing like that. Technically, by all statistical probability, the third wave has to be smaller than the first wave.
Okay.
Because by the time there is not enough denominator to infect. By the time we reach a third wave, India would probably immunize at least 20% of its population, Kerala would probably cross 30% of that. So the virus has to fail in the third wave. And there is no need to predict that. The only thing is to delay it further and to make it as broad as possible so that you are not bothered. You have to live with the third wave, and the third wave is going to be our new normal for quite some time. And you may have multiple undulations after that. There is no point in calling them 4, 5, 6, 7, 8.
Okay.
It is just the mathematics of this, because if you have a 2, you have to have a 4, then you have to, it's just like a natural sine form like that.
Okay.
And the only thing is, when can we go back to normal? India at this time have like 3 to 4 crores of infection documented.
Okay.
And the economists recently modeled saying that these numbers are grossly underreported, including deaths. So you have to multiply it by factors of 5 or 10 to know the real infections and other things like that. And if you add the vaccination and the infection, if it crosses 2/3 of the population, it has to end. So for us to reach that point, like 1/3 of infections with 1/3 of vaccinations, it's going to be another 6 to 9 months for India.
Okay.
For the state of Kerala, it could be another 3 months,
Okay.
but for India, it could be like middle of next year.
Okay. Fine. Okay. Any other comments from anyone? Okay, okay. I think we covered the topic reasonably extensively, but at the same time, we all know that each question itself can be a topic of discussion in itself. I think we'll come back with smaller sessions. Until then, bye bye.